All right, so as I mentioned today, we are starting a new series, and it kind of leads us to a place where we're trying to understand how to be able to believe when there's objections. There's things that come in front of us, and people are like, I really want to jump on that. I really want to believe. I really want to see and receive all the benefits that Jesus brings. But, there's that but, right? There's always a hurdle. There's always a ceiling. There's always I can believe until. That's always going to hold us back. And we're thinking, I just want to believe. I'd like to have faith. I'd like to trust. But really, as I was going through and putting together the outline for this and going through the series, I was constantly looking at some of these objections. I even reached out to some groups of people around, and I said, hey, so what, I'm thinking about this, and these are the things. And they're like, oh, well, have you thought about this? And I said, yep, that one's kind of in there already. Have you thought about this? Yeah, so even people who are in the church, people who already believe, trust by faith, and all the things of God are still saying, I can come up with at least 100 objections. You see, what happens, though, and what I believe through all of the ways in which we talk about objections, we talk about the hurdles, we talk about the ceilings, we talk about the things that are holding us back. These are all based on our own ideas of what we've made God to be. Because I don't believe any of these objections are actually objections to rejecting God as God is revealed. Ultimately, they're objections and hurdles that we've created. So everything comes from a distorted view of how we're going to make God into the image of how we want to see God. So as I mentioned, there's probably hundreds of distorted views of God. But in this series, we're going to talk about 6. So hopefully, in the midst of these 6 objections, you'll find that there's all kinds of those hundreds of different other distortions of God that we're also going to be addressed in those 6. I believe that there's lots found beneath those. And so we're going to talk about all of it. Today, this is what we're going to talk about is God on demand. And this is where it comes from. I remember a day that I was watching TV, that I know that some of the TV shows that I was watching as a kid, if I didn't get there when they were on, then I would never see them again. I know that there are some out there who didn't have this. They haven't had that. There hasn't been a day for them that they've been able to say, you know what, if it's my favorite show and it's going to be on at 11 o'clock a.m. on a Saturday morning, then I've got to be up and making sure that I'm going to be prepared to watch it at 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Or many of the shows that were network shows during the week, that you knew that you say, it's on at 6 o'clock on this night, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and if I'm not there, I'm going to miss it and it's going to be gone. But today, we don't have to worry about that, do we? Today, we can literally, if there's a show that has ever been created, well, most likely created, that we can just say, hey, Siri, hey, Alexa, find me this show. And boom, it's going to come up. I remember there was a show, and I think it only lasted 2 seasons, but I think the song was more popular than the show was, but it was The Greatest American Hero. And the song, it always sticks in my head, even though, I went back and I actually did this. It's on demand. You can go and find it somewhere. You can find the show and you can play it and watch it. It doesn't hold up, though. I'll just tell you that right now before you go and try to find it. It doesn't hold up. But that's the thing. It's like every show, if you missed it then, you're like, wait a second, now I can binge watch an entire season all within an afternoon. Everything's on demand. And so that's the concept that we have today for everything. It even goes to church and to sermons and to messages that are preached. You can say, you know what? Like, there's no need for me to go to church. There's no need for me to be in that place because I've got every sermon on demand. What do I need you for, Pastor? And that's really the question, right? It's the reason why we still don't have people in church right now. I'm just going to say that. Because there's so many times it's just easier for us to say, well, I've got church on demand. I've got church when it's convenient for me. And even though we're actually missing out on the many opportunities to be able to connect with one another, we still are looking for what's comfortable. Because we know also then ultimately God's always going to be on demand. God's going to be there. We know it, we preach it, we say it. It doesn't mean that, like we're not saying in this series, like right now with the God on demand, that God actually isn't present for you. No, God really is. But what we've turned God into this God on demand is more like a cosmic genie, a cosmic vending machine. So we're looking at God not as the creator of the heavens and the earth, the one who is in control and in, has everything under control. We're looking at it and saying, God, you're here to grant my wishes. Why aren't you doing it? I've been praying for this relationship to work out. And I've been praying that God would help that relationship to make sure it's molded and strengthened and staying together, but it's not happening. The child prays that their parents would stay together. You're saying, hey, I'm here, I'm giving, of my money, I'm doing some good out there in the world, but why is it that I'm still struggling in life? And probably the biggest one, the ones that sends people packing from the church all the time. I'm praying for my loved one to be healed, and now they're gone. You see, it's really easy to conclude that if we don't find that God is answering all of our prayers, and listen to this, not just answering our prayers, but answering it the way that we want it to be answered, then what do we conclude? God's not real. God must not be there. Because I asked for it, God should have produced it. And these are the real questions that pop up in life. These are the things, the real situations, the real things that happen. And we're looking at it and we're saying, God tells us to pray about it. God tells us to be able to ask for it. God tells us to be able to say that He's going to listen to our prayer. God says that He wants our best. Well, don't I know what's best for me? Don't I know what's best for my loved ones? And yet we conclude that if this isn't the thing that's playing out, then God must not listen, God must not be real, God must not be there. But here's the thing. On demand, God doesn't exist. Cosmic genie, it's a made-up thing. The cosmic vending machines, the sending up our wishes and God granting them like a genie, doesn't exist. That is one more distortion of what we've made God to be. Why? Because everything else around us is on demand. Why can't God be? Here's the key point. Tweetable moment. Put it out there on Facebook. take it on Instagram, put it in a nice pretty frame. God doesn't exist to serve us. We exist to serve God. If God isn't on demand, then who is God? And that's what we're going to answer today. And we got a couple of points here, actually 3 points. And the first one is this: God's heart is always loving. So here's the part that we're going to look back on. And these are the things that we talked about in the Clay Feet series. Getting back to the characteristics of God. Knowing God's heart is going to be able to be the way that we're going to understand how people are going to distort God. And so if we know God's heart, if we know who God is, then we're going to say, of course, God's not going to just answer me like a genie. He's not going to grant me 3 wishes. He's not going to just do everything that I say, that I want done. So we look at God's heart. God's heart is always loving. Think about this. If you're a parent, there's never a time that you don't love your children. There's never a time that you're saying, there's times that you don't like your children. That's a real fact right there. But you always love them. But that doesn't mean you're going to say, all right, I'm going to have to do everything that they say that they want done. That wouldn't make sense, right? Because that would turn into, as Steve and I were talking about it this week, is that whole, the one sketch of the person that I won't mention their name, but you'll probably know who they are, is the chocolate cake for breakfast scenario. Because every child wants to be able to dig into chocolate cake at all times of the day. It doesn't matter if it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And so what do? You're saying as a parent, chocolate cake is probably not good for you for breakfast. But we're just going to say, oh yeah, sure, let's do chocolate cake for breakfast. It has wheat, flour, right? It has eggs. Why not? Because what happens as a parent if you're just saying, hey, let's just do whatever it is that the child wants to do? Does that make sense? You see, there's the parts about being a parent that what we're saying is hey, you know what? We've lived a little bit longer. We have a little bit more experience. And here's the thing about it, child. This is the fact that I want you to know. I love you completely. I love you wholly. But I'm not going to allow you to do the things that are going to hurt you. It's the same way as we look at God today. Let's look at Romans. Romans chapter 8. We're going further down into chapter 8, starting with verse 35. Can anything separate us from Christ's love? Does it mean He no longer loves us if we have trouble or calamity, or are persecuted or hungry or destitute or in danger or threatened with death? Go to 37. No. Despite all these things, overwhelming victory is ours through Christ who loved us. I am convinced that nothing can separate us from God's love. Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons. Neither our fears for today or our worries for tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. So let's look at this, right? You see, there's a moment with God's love. And God's love is saying, I'm always going to be there for you. And even though, as Paul points out here to the church in Rome, is that he's saying, but there is, we're going to run into all kinds of problems. We're going to run into sickness and calamity. We're going to run into things of persecution. We are going to run into all of those problems. That's a guarantee. But it doesn't mean that we can correlate that because we're going through problems, through sickness, through calamity, that all of a sudden God's not present there or God doesn't love us. We need to understand God's heart in this. We need to understand that God's love is present even through the difficulties. God's love, God doesn't prove His love by answering our prayers. God doesn't say, okay, so sometimes parenting works like this. Sometimes when we look at it, we're saying, hey, I really want my children to like me. And so what am I going to do? I'm just going to let them do whatever they want to do. I'm just going to let them, go out there and create their own danger. I'm going to go out there. Why? Because I really want them to like me. I really want to show them how much I love them by allowing them to be able to even take on harmful things. Right? God's like, here's the thing about this. He's like, I'm not just going to grant you a wish just to be able to show you how much I love you. What did God do? It says there in Romans, what did God do to show you how much He loves you? He sent Jesus, God in the flesh, to die the death that you deserved, that I deserved, and to be able to bring victory to you. You see, we didn't deserve it, and yet God shows us how much He loves us by going to that full extent. God's like, this is how much I love you. And so when we look at, like, God, if you really want to prove yourself, then this is what you need to do for me. You see, those are the parts, and looking back at the Old Testament reminds us, God says, don't put God to the test. Moses tells us that in the mount, when they're receiving all of those things. Don't put God to the test. God's going to come through. Why? Because God always comes through. Just not the way that you're always thinking. And this leads us into our second point today. That God's ways are always higher than ours. We look at things in the world today. And it's unavoidable. There are things in the world that are unexplainable. Why do these things occur? When an 18-month-old child gets shot, when people are murdered on the streets, when natural disasters occur that take hundreds of lives, we say, how is this? And we want, ultimately, what we want to ask, we're like, God, can you just take it away, reverse it? Let's hit that rewind button so that we don't have to go through that. We don't want to see it. We don't want to experience it. And I can't tell you today, every single one of those, we can look at an explanation and say, well, that's the reason for it. There are some people, and even Christians today, this is where it gets confusing, where they like to be able to explain every little piece. They like to be able to say, oh, that hurricane, it's because those people were sinful. Whoa, that doesn't make sense. Because we all are. And if God was going to send a hurricane because a people were sinful, and He would just send the hurricane upon the whole land, the whole planet. So when we look at things and say, well, this doesn't make sense to me, we're going to have to say, you know what, I don't get it. We can understand that. We can say, God, I don't understand it. This is what God says. Isaiah. And this is the passage that was read just a moment before. But Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, God says, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Right? So God's trying to remind us of something, right? And so you see, and even in this moment, God's not trying to say, well, let me explain to you what's happening in the midst of this natural disaster. Let me try to explain to you what's happening in the midst of these unexplained things that happen. Like, God's not saying, He's like, but here, I want you to hear this, follower of Jesus, walking in the world today, is that we're saying, God's like, here, let me remind you that we don't think alike. You see, what God's doing is He's saying there is a bigger picture, things that you don't even see, that you can't comprehend, that God is doing. And what I always like to be able to point out is that because God's ways are higher, because God's plans are bigger, is that we never know the things that we're going to be praying for, that God's like, no, that's going to hurt you, and I'm not going to be able to put that into play because I've got something better. And we look at it and say, no, God, this is better for me. This is better right now because I want it now. I want it on demand. I want it in this moment. I want it this second. And we turn up just like those cranky children who haven't slept, who are throwing tantrums and saying, no, God, no, God, no. We don't understand what we're looking at in this whole temporal thing and saying, God, no, look at this. I've mapped it out. Here's the plan. This is the part. If I just get this, then I'll be able to go there and everything's going to work out. You see, I already have it mapped out, and God's like, you don't see. You don't understand. And there are those parts that we say, God, help me to be able to see the plan that's bigger. Help me to be able to have those eyes to see and ears to hear. Help me to be able to see that your plan is going to be greater. And sometimes God's like, hey, this is the thing, this is the fact, and this is what we have to know and believe as followers of Jesus, is that sometimes we're just not going to understand. There are things that we're going to be able to see, and we're going to be able to look back and say, oh, like, I see what you did there, God. Like, you didn't want to answer that one, or you answered it, and you said, no, not right now, because you had this for me. Let me give you an example. Real example. So this was me. So I was, and most of you know, some of you may be a new story, but I didn't want to be a pastor. If you didn't know that, then here's the shocking reveal. I didn't want to be a pastor. And for a long time, I did everything to avoid being a pastor. But here's the thing. So every journey along my life, and even as we got married, we had children, we built our house, right? We lived and we had, Heather was working and everything was going well. I was transitioning from college and trying to be able to figure out, was I going to go into law enforcement, and what did that look like? And then I was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. And so what did I do? I started to switch a path, and I'm like, hey, financial advisor, that's good. I started to be able to study for all of that. Went through all the tests, and it's looking like all the doors are opening. But then things didn't work out. And I'm like, wait a second. This isn't supposed to happen. Like, God, do you know the plan, God? Because I already looked at it, and I switched the track a whole bunch of times, right? And here was this track, and it was laid out for you, God, to just bless it. And what did God have? He had a bigger plan. What did God have? He had another path in mind. He said, no, wait a second. There's going to be people that I'm going to put in your path later on, and you're not even going to be thinking anything about this. But here's the thing. When I was stuck in that path, and then things weren't working, and I was like, well, this is terrible. This must mean God doesn't hear me. This must mean that God doesn't care. Or maybe God's not real. See, there's certain parts that we're going to get to see why something didn't work out. There's going to be parts that we're going to get to see that God's going to show us, that we can look back and celebrate and praise God that His ways are bigger than ours, that His thoughts are greater than ours. Why? Because we're going to look back and say, yeah, well, if I would have gone that path, I would have missed out on all of this. But there's certain times that we're also not going to see it. And we're still going to be able to lift up and say, God, but your ways are higher, your thoughts are higher, and I still know you've got bigger plans. Point number 3. God's presence is always enough. So, this one will be a familiar passage for you. Chances are you've heard this one a number of times, but I'm going to point back to this. Psalm 23, verse 4. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, as some translations say, the shadow of death, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect me and comfort me. See, here's the part, and then the psalmist David, as he's writing Psalm 23, and it's a psalm that people often use for funerals, for memorials, to be reminded that our good shepherd walks beside us. Why? Because it's in the moments of death, it's in the moments of suffering that we're saying, I need to be reminded of where God is. That God's not just floating somewhere on a cloud, but God's present. Even in those darkest moments, even when the things that we're looking around say, I don't know how it could get worse, this is where we're going to rely and trust in things that are bigger than us. Because God is going to remind us that God is present. God's going to say, don't worry, I'm never going to leave you. I'm never going to forsake you. We're always going to be together. See, God's present, reminding us in every moment. Reminding us, and this is the reason why when we always leave, we talk about God not being contained to a building. God doesn't stay here and say, all right, I'll see you guys next week. God's like, where are we going today after church? Are we going shopping? Are we going out to eat? Are we going to a friend's house? You see, God, when He's like, let's go, He's saying, we are on a mission together. What's going to happen today? All kinds of adventures could happen. God reminds us that there's a presence that He, as He goes with us in our life, that He's not contained here. And that's the reason why we can be reminded, even in those sufferings, and even in those parts that aren't pretty, and even in the darkness, God's like, I'm here. God isn't going to do everything that we want God to do when we want God to do it. That's like a for sure statement. Because God doesn't exist to serve you and me. We exist to serve God. God is too powerful, too wise, too magnificent, and too good to be a puppet for humans. And this is the reason why the whole God on demand is just a distortion. It's not the God that exists. It's not the God that we want to try to make Him to be. But God is the one who knows all, who sees all, whose thoughts are bigger, whose heart is loving, and who is always present with us. In Jesus' name, Amen.